I want to welcome you all to our event on the future of Social Security. I'm Greg Roston, the Interim Director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, or SEPR, and I'm glad you can all join us today. SEPR is co-hosting this event with the American Enterprise Institute, the Brookings Institution, and the Bipartisan Policy Center. Before we jump into today's discussions, I invite everyone to join us on Thursday here at SEPR for our policy forum on trade policy. That will be held in person, and I hope many of you are able to make it. Check out our website for more details. Today's event demonstrates a key component of our mission at SEPR, convening the leading economic scholars and policy experts to analyze our greatest economic policy challenges and to provide nonpartisan evidence to inform policy solutions. All of our panelists, with the exception of Gopi Shah Goda, who's on via Zoom, are here in the SEPR building on Stanford's campus. And we're all looking forward to a great discussion on one of the most important and yet under-discussed topics facing our government and fellow taxpayers. I know there are plenty of people tuning in today who are deeply interested in the future of Social Security. We are incredibly grateful for your engagement and interest, and I invite everyone participating today to continue this discussion in the continuing weeks and months, and most likely years ahead. No matter the results of November's election, it's going to take an incredible amount of discussion, debate, and analysis to inform the policy choices around Social Security. So, in my mind, simply put, there are only two main areas where we need to get agreement: how much money should be provided to retirees and disabled workers net of taxes, and how to raise that money. Obviously, that's a bit tongue-in-cheek because the current system will need to be revamped a lot in one or both of these ways, and necessary reforms are not on any politician's agenda at this point in time. So I first got interested in Social Security when I was an undergraduate student taking public finance in 1983. For those of you who have studied it, that was a watershed year for Social Security, and we will hear much more about 1983 today and how the challenge was then met and how that was different then than it is now. For me, though, the message I took home was simply that my full retirement age was being shifted from 65 to 67. Who said economists are selfish? Well, that got me started thinking about Social Security, and then through taking John Chauvin's course as a graduate student 2 years later, and more recently regularly teaching a section on Social Security in my classes on economic policy analysis, I've become much more interested in the program overall and not just what I'm going to get from it. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the panelists today. We have 6 great panelists, and I'm going to do brief introductions for each of them now because the format of this conference where we hope we get discussion amongst the panel on each presentation. We'll do that before going to audience questions, but there's going to be a session just for audience questions, so use the Q&A button to submit questions, and we're going to try and get through some of those questions, especially towards the end of the session. So to go through I'm going to go through the panelists now in order of the presentations. The first session is the John session, John Cogan and John Chauvin. John Cogan is the Leonard and Shirley Ely Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he's an author of a book called The High Cost of Good Intentions on government programs. John Chauvin is the Charles Schwab Professor of Economics Emeritus and also the former director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And he's the author of The Real Deal, looking at Social Security. The next panelist is Andrew Biggs, who's also an author of a real book, The Real Retirement Crisis: Why Almost Everything You Know About the U.S. Retirement System is Wrong. And he's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The next speaker is Kristen Shapiro, who's a counsel at Baker Hostetler Law Firm, and she's worked in all 3 branches of the federal government, clerking for Judge Kaczynski here, working on the Hill, and then the Department of Justice before going into private practice. We have Jason Fitchner, who's the chief economist of the Bipartisan Policy Center and the author of The Hidden Cost of Federal Tax Policy. And finally, online, we have Gopi Shah Goda, who is the director of the Retirement Security Project at the Brookings Institution. She's also the inaugural holder of the Alice Rivlin Chair in Economic Policy and a senior fellow at Brookings. Gopi was the deputy director of SEPR and a specialist in public finance, healthcare, and aging. So once again, I want to thank all of our panelists who are here today and everyone joining us online. If you have questions for any of our speakers, again, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we're going to review those submissions, and then I will be the one, I will go through them, and I will try to do the best I can to ask your questions in the way that we're done. So I want to start with panel one, which is going to be John Chauvin and John Cogan. So take it away.
So John and I decided we'd divide up things a little bit. I'd talk about the 1977 amendments to start with, and then John would follow with the importance of the 1983 amendments, and then we'd launch into a little discussion of the lessons and what John and I have learned from those pieces of legislation. But you know, the 1977 law was perhaps, I think, the most important post-World War II law for Social Security. It literally set the trajectory for the program over the last 40 years, and it's really the reason that we face the Social Security funding problem that we have today. When I talk to audiences about the 77 amendments, I usually begin by asking them, who do you think was the weakest president in post-war World War II America? And the answers vary all over the place, but the most often cited answer is, of course, Jimmy Carter. But then I tell them, well, Jimmy Carter was the first president to face a Social Security funding crisis. He successfully solved it. He solved it without gimmicks. He solved it with higher taxes and a reduction in benefits. And so in my view, it's one of the most important pieces of Social Security legislation in our history. So what did the law do? Well, when President Carter took office, it faced a short-term and a long-term problem. The short-term problem was that the trust fund would run out of money in 6 years, very short period of time for legislative action. The long-term problem was a serious underfunding of the benefits. In order to finance the promised benefits, payroll taxes would have to be raised, according to estimates at the time, by about 70%. And so massive underfunding of the benefit structure. Why did we have that problem? Well, there were several reasons, one of which was a poorly performing economy in the early part of the 70s, big benefit increases from 1965 to 1973. But I think the most important source of the funding, short-term funding problem and long-term funding problem, was a mistake that Congress had made when they decided in 1972 to index Social Security benefits to inflation. The mistake was that they, in effect, doubly indexed the initial benefits that a person gets when they first come on the rolls, doubly indexed that benefit to inflation. And they did it at a worse time. We had never seen anything like the inflation that we saw in the 70s. So initial benefits started rising very rapidly from the time that policy was introduced to 1977. Here's how much that policy raised benefits. The typical beneficiary who retired in 1985 was expected to get a Social Security benefit that was 48% higher in real terms than the benefit that a person who entered the rolls in 1975 would get. So the increase was just not sustainable, and Congress took action to address it. So how did they address it? One, they raised payroll taxes. Both the rate and the taxable wage base were increased. The Washington Post called the increase the largest tax increase in U.S. history. It was a very large increase. Second, it reduced promised benefits to individuals. It left the benefits to current retirees unchanged, but it reduced the benefits that were promised to future retirees. And for this law, the future was not very far away. It affected individuals who, in 1978, the year right after the law was passed, individuals who were in 1978 were age 58. So they were 4 years away from Social Security's early retirement benefit. And so they weren't given much time to prepare, but apparently it was enough because the proposal went through. A person who retired 20 years down the road would receive a benefit reduction that was on the order of 15 to 20%. So the benefit reductions were substantial, and they were the first benefit reductions in the history of the program. The third thing that the law did was to impose a new method of increasing initial benefits over time. They indexed the initial benefit to the growth in wages in the economy. And that formula has remained roughly unchanged for 40 years and has really driven the benefit levels that we have today in the program. And I'll close with this. Most important, it rejected the gimmick of using general revenues to finance the benefit program. President Carter's administration had in fact proposed a general revenue financing, but after an extensive debate in the Senate and in the House, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, rejected the infusion of general revenues. And so that's the 77 law, tremendously important. It's the reason I think that we're here today. So, John?
Okay, well, the 77 law, they thought they had fixed Social Security for 75 years. And only 4 years later, 1981, Reagan comes in office, and the forecast is Social Security will run out of money in 2 years. In other words, the 75-year solution turned out to be a 6-year solution. So you can see that assumptions were made that didn't pan out. The economy, largely it was the macro economy, even between 77 and 82 or so, was very disappointing. Stagflation, unemployment, inflation. And so suddenly, when Reagan comes in 81, Social Security is again expected to have a trust fund problem in his administration, in, say, 1983, unless something is done. And so I'm not sure that members of Congress and the public completely appreciated this, but the Reagan administration did appreciate it and started working on a plan immediately upon their taking office in January of 81. And they came up with a plan in a matter of a couple of months. I refer to it as the Stockman Plan, after David Stockman, who's head of OMB. And it had a number of elements, but it had one element that caught all the attention, and that attention was negative. It reduced the early retirement benefit by, I think, 37.5%. Basically, always, if you retired at 62, you got 80% as much as if you waited till 65. They proposed 50%. So 80% became 50%, which sounds like a 3/8 reduction. And immediately. Congress rejected that essentially unanimously. Republicans were caught off guard. Democrats were opposed to it. Everybody was opposed to it. And so it was a complete non-starter. And so the administration was, really bloodied. That was a complete failure. And so you have to try some other strategy, because Social Security, the checks are really going to be either delayed or reduced in a couple of years. Reagan decides this is time for bipartisanship. This is so hard. Let's make it bipartisan, have a national commission. And he and Tip O'Neill agreed to this, and they set up this commission. 5 members were picked by Reagan and the administration, 5 by Tip O'Neill in the House, 5 by Howard Baker in the Senate. And it truly was bipartisan. In the end, the 15 members had 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats. This was done in September of 81. And they were given until the end of 82 to come up with a solution. And Tip O'Neill and Reagan, more or less privately, but promised each other that they would support whatever the commission came up with, as long as it wasn't completely unreasonable, they wouldn't oppose it. And so that agreement was very important. So the commission goes to work and had about 9 politicians among the 15, but others were experts. Nobody, although it's kind of unwieldy, it was kind of big. And they work all through 1982. And the honest answer is they got nowhere. The Republicans were dead set against tax increases. The Democrats were dead set against benefit cuts. And you're not going to get anywhere unless you do one of those two. And so end of the year comes, 1982. They've been at it for 15 months. They've got nothing. And they asked Reagan for a 1-month extension. He gives them a 2-week extension. And but still, there's no momentum for a solution. So Bob Dole, senator from Kansas, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, writes an op-ed in the New York Times saying failure is not an option, and basically hinting that a tax increase might be necessary as part of the solution. So that was a break in the Republican position against tax increases. Pat Moynihan, also on the commission, immediately gets together with Dole and says, let's form a small group, a group of 5, plus 2 from the administration, but 5 of the subset of the 15, plus 2, and see if we can't come up with a solution. Now that you've made it so that tax increases could occur, maybe I can see some benefit cuts and so forth. So they came up with a plan, and the larger committee voted for their plan. They didn't seem to be too upset that they had been ruled out. They weren't part of it, but so that now, what did that plan do? Well, it was limited. It was kind of cautious. It didn't really solve the entire problem. The entire problem was we have a short-run problem of how do we get through the 1980s. Social Security needed to get through the 80s. The 80s, it looked like they were going to have deficits with no trust fund, so they had to get through the 80s. But then in the 1990s and the 2000s, the first 10 years of the new century, there was no problem. The intermediate run was fine. Why? Because the baby boomers were in their peak earning years. There weren't many retirees because the Great Depression were small birth cohorts, and World War II small birth cohorts. The heydays of Social Security was the 1990s, so they and the first 10 years of this decade, of this century. So there was a short run problem, and then there was a long run problem, the 75-year problem. The truth is, the commission tackled only the short run problem. They made benefits taxable. Only 50% of benefits were taxable at that time for middle and high income recipients. They delayed the cost of living adjustments by 6 months, not just once, but it was delayed 6 months. It's always going to be 6 months later than previous. They accelerated some payroll tax increases that were already on the books, but they made them happen earlier. Those were the main elements. They brought in some new beneficiaries or new participants, particularly federal civil service employees. Now, one thing I would say is there really were only 3 possible solutions. There's 3 possible helpful steps. 1 is to cut benefits, 2 is to raise taxes, and 3 is to use general revenues. And they did all 3. And I actually going to have John just comment about how they use general revenues. So part of their solution was dipping into general revenues. Can you tell us why they did that, how they did that?
Yeah, so as you said, John, they got down to the end and they didn't have an agreement. And so the final agreement was really put together in the last few weeks of the commission. And they came up short. they didn't have enough to allow full benefits to be paid the following year. And so they ended up with sort of an accounting gimmick, but at least it had a sort of a cloak of legitimacy to it. It turned out that years earlier, for people that had gone into the armed services, they had provided them with extra earnings credits so that their benefits when they retired wouldn't be reduced because they had served in the military. And so those benefits that were being paid were just being paid out of the trust fund. But the gimmick, or the final solution, if you will, said, look, we're going to reimburse the Social Security Trust Fund for those higher payments that we had been giving to military retirees or people that had served in the military. And so it was cloaked within the system and not an outright general revenue kind of funding provision. John, you mentioned that you called it the Dave Stockman plan.
Right.
Well, I was at OMB at the time, and Dave would call it the Richard Darman plan. And Richard Darman called it the Dave Stockman plan, and they both called it the Dick Schweiker plan. He was the secretary of HHS, who had no idea what this plan was. In any event.
Nobody had, it had no parents.
No. That's right. You mentioned, John, the short and the long run.
Yeah.
There was a stab at the long run, I think, with raising the retirement age.
Oh, let me. So basically, this limited plan that commission agreed on went to Congress, and the head of the Social Security Subcommittee of the Ways and Means Committee was Jake Pickle, a Democrat from Texas, early ally of Lyndon Johnson. I've been there a long time. He thought that the commission's job was incomplete, that they had not established 75-year solvency for the system, and so he had a proposal. Remember, this is a Democrat from Texas. His proposal is to raise the what was called the normal retirement age from 65 to 67. But he was going to do it on a far future basis, a delayed basis. None of the increase would happen for 17 years. Starting in the year 2000, which is a long ways away from 1983, the age would begin to go up, and it really wouldn't go all the way to 67 until 2022. This was the full adjustment only applied to 23-year-olds in 1983. So it was way in the future, and he was able to get that through, that amendment added to the bill, passed the House and the Senate. Well, it didn't quite get in the Senate version, but it survived the House-Senate compromise, or whatever you call it, a conciliation, and that was part of the law. That was the biggest element of the entire thing. If it weren't for the Pickle Amendment, the trust fund would be broke today. That's the thing that extended the life of the trust fund. And of course, that is a benefit cut, or at least a cut in promised benefits. You could say it's not a benefit cut because of increased life expectancy, but that was a key element. And that's what gave us, so I'm a Stanford grader, I gave the whole thing about an A-. I think it was politically, it was an amazing job that, in the end, quite bipartisan. And I think there are several heroes for getting that passed. I think both Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan deserve credit. I think Bob Dole, Pat Moynihan deserve credit. I think Pickle deserved credit. That's a pretty bipartisan group. And they showed leadership and, and it's kind of interesting that Dole opened the door to tax increases, a Republican, and Pickle, a Democrat, had the biggest proposal for cutting benefits. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine that something like this will happen again. Another problem is I think the reason the raising the retirement age got through is that it didn't affect anybody's anytime soon. So members of Congress were willing to do it, but they would have been opposed to having go back to their district and say, I cut your benefits. But I cut your grandkids' benefits. That kind of worked. So that would be my summary. Now, let me just contrast that situation to the situation we're going to face in the mid-2030s. Whether it's 2035 or 2033 or 2034, I'm not going to get into it, but it's pretty different. So they had a short-run problem, intermediate problem, no problem, back in '83 because of the demographics. And then they had a long-term problem. Now we have a short-run problem and an intermediate-term problem and a long-term problem, and we don't have, in a way, that baby boom generation made the 1990s and the 2000, the first decade of the 2000s no problem, and that allowed for the delay in raising the retirement age. We don't have that luxury now. We need money in the short run and more money in the short run, medium run, long run. So I think it's a much, much harder problem to solve. And that one wasn't solved easily. So I think I'll leave it there.
Right, so obviously from the discussion we've just had, a couple of very simple lessons to be taken from both those pieces of legislation. Presidential leadership, profoundly important. Jimmy Carter did not wait till his second term. Remember, he had 6 years. And he didn't wait till his second term to propose the fix. Ronald Reagan, after getting shellacked by the Senate in May of 1981 with his plan, could have walked away. He could have said, look, Congress, you've rejected my plan. You are on your own. Come up with your plan. Didn't do that. Worked to form the commission. And so presidential leadership, crucially important here. Another lesson, of course, is the sooner the better. We're getting to a point where it almost looks like, to many, that general revenue financing is going to be part of the solution. To me, it's a phony solution for two reasons. One is it doesn't involve anything really to do with Social Security. It's just grabbing revenues that we don't really have. I'll stop there. There are no general revenues to share. We're running deficits now, excluding Social Security, of upwards of $1.8, $1.7 trillion. And so the money's not there. It is a pure accounting gimmick that will allow benefits to be paid. It is not fixing any problem either for Social Security or helping with the budget. When we think about the future of reform, we have to think about it differently than we thought about things in 1977 and 1983. Back then, we looked at Social Security as a system within itself, and we didn't concern ourselves really with other sources of income outside of Social Security for retirees. The situation is vastly different today. There has been literally a revolution in retirement income generation between the early 80s, late 70s, and today. Back in 1977 and in 1983, John, IRAs were in their infancy. 401k legislation hadn't been enacted until, 1978. And in 1982, when I was there, we were still working on the regulations to implement 401ks. So those two vehicles weren't important as a source of retirement income. Work was not that much of a source of retirement income as well. But since the early 1980s, incomes of seniors have grown enormously. A couple of statistics from work that Danny Heil and I did last year using the Survey of Consumer Finances. The median real income of the typical senior households headed by a person age 65 or older, has grown by 82% since 1982, and I stop at 2018. So 82 to 2018, 82% increase in the median real income of senior households. For contrast, the median income of younger households under age 65 has grown by 23%. So senior incomes have risen 4 times faster than the people that are paying into the program. The increase has been broad-based, all education levels, all sub-age groups. In fact, the fastest growing subgroup of seniors in terms of age is seniors age 75 and older, and that's both in relative terms and absolute terms. All types of households, their incomes have grown faster than non-senior households. The increase goes across the income distribution. At the 25th percentile, incomes have grown over 90%. At the 75th percentile, also over 90%. So there's been this huge growth in senior incomes. Right now, the typical senior household, once you adjust for taxes and for household size, their median income is about the same as the median income of all younger households. So for a large group of seniors, in fact, for half of all seniors, now have incomes that place them firmly in the middle class or the middle 50% of the income distribution. What has caused this? Well, it's been a boon in retirement savings vehicles, 401ks, defined benefit plans, which had been in existence, they've matured. Fundamental change in work patterns of seniors. After a century of decline in probability of working if you're a senior, it turned around and now it's much higher than it was in the 80s and in the 90s, both for men and for women. And so the sources of income based upon employment and retirement vehicles, savings vehicles, has been the primary source. The main beneficiaries of this, although not the exclusive beneficiaries of these new retirement vehicles, are middle and upper income individuals that have had the disposable income that they could put to retirement savings during their working years. And so when we think about reform, we have to think about the entire spectrum of income, retirement income for seniors, not as we were able to in the early 1980s and 1977, I think just about Social Security by itself. So maybe, John, then you could talk a little bit about how you've thought about how to deal with this sort of fundamental change in retirement income.
So, first of all, I was going to just add a little bit. You know, I mentioned that the 75-year solution lasted 6 years. The 1983 75-year solution, which is supposed to get us to 2059, now looks like, well, by 1994, 10 years later, the exhaustion date was 2029. So obviously, assumptions were overly optimistic both times. One assumption that one important assumption is the total fertility rate. Now, in 1983, the assumption was the total fertility rate would be 2.0. That's the intermediate assumption. And it hasn't been 2.0 for quite a while. It's been lower than that. So I looked to see what the assumption is today. In the 2024 Social Security report, it's 1.9. Now, what is the total fertility rate? It's 1.6. If you're running a pay-as-you-go type of system, the fertility rates are kind of important. And there's a pretty big difference between 1.6 and 1.9. And I don't know anybody who has a compelling story of why fertility is going to be going up. So that's interesting that I think we've been overly optimistic in our assumptions. I think it's also probably true on productivity, a few other key things, but I'll just focus on it. So I asked myself, well, what could we have done in 83, or maybe at least a long time ago? So I looked at what I was writing 25 years ago. And one thing I was writing was with Syl Schieber. We wrote The Real Deal, which has been mentioned. It was called, the subtitle was The History and Future of Social Security. And we had a plan which we called Personal Security Accounts 2000. But with Syl, I wrote this 25 years ago. It wasn't top of mind. So I went to Google and said Personal Security Accounts 2000. And there was an AI summary of the plan. And I'd never read an AI summary of something I wrote. It was only, there's 40, 50, 60-page versions of this. It was 4 paragraphs. But I must say, for 4 paragraphs, it was pretty good.
Is that a Stanford A minus?
So let me tell you what personal security accounts would have done. The payroll tax was going to be in that plan, and I'm not saying that was the only way to go. And I also think this would have been, if this had been adopted in 2000, it might have looked pretty good. Whether it should be adopted now is another feature, another question. So what was the plan? Payroll tax, leave it the same, 12.4%, same base, so no tax increase. Benefits in the long run, there's a huge long transition plan, but in the long run, there'd be 2 types of benefits. One type is a defined benefit, and it would be a flat benefit, just completely flat. Everybody gets the same benefit. In 2000, it was $500 a month. But today, in today's dollar, because it was wage index, $1,087 or $13,044 a year. So that's, everybody gets $13,000, a little more than $13,000. That's just your first benefit. Your second benefit is that there'd be a defined contribution part, and that would require let's call it a mandated contribution of 2.5% to individuals, new money. In addition to your payroll tax, you pay 2.5% into your own account, and that would be matched by Social Security with another 2.5%. You can think of it as a rebate of your 12.4%. And so you'd have a 5% account that would, and you'd have some discretion as how it was invested. The government match would have to be withdrawn as a life inflation index life annuity. Your half, you'd have discretion on how you withdrew it. Now, the transition, shades of the Pickle Amendment. We said nobody over 55 is going to have any of these new benefits. They're just going to have the benefits they have now. So it wouldn't affect anybody over 55. And the only people that would be solely on the new plan are people 25 and under. Only the sort of new workers would have the new plan. If you're between 25 and 55, you'd get some of each. So it had that same feature that the Pickle Amendment had, which it really didn't apply immediately to anybody. It did achieve 75-year balance, and most importantly, it was running a surplus in year 75 and all those out years. In fact, sufficiently that we could project that the 12.4% might be, could be reduced. But now, what would its features be? Well, one feature is it would roughly preserve the progressivity of the current system. What I did mentally is think of somebody who's working full-time at minimum wage for a long career. And today, as you may know, there's a lot of different minimum wages in the United States. Some states have $7.25, some have $15. I think the average is about $12.50. So I took $25,000 as the minimum wage income on average in the United States. Well, you've got $13,000 in that intercept. That the defined benefit, flat benefit, that's $13,000. So that's what, that's a 52% replacement rate. And you've got this 5% account, which will easily get you, even if it's invested safely, to a, say, 72% replacement rate. And I compared that with what replacement rate the current system offers a full-time minimum wage worker. The new plan, you'd end up with more, not less. After all, the full-time minimum wage worker is going to have be partly on the 90% slope and partly on the 32% slope of the PIA formula, and they're going to end up less than 72. So the low-income people would get just as much. Middle and high-income people would get just as much. Now, there's nothing magic. There is 2.5% more money. You could debate whether that's a tax or a mandatory contribution. There is a slight difference. You are being mandated to put money into your own account, and you have some control of how it's invested, and you have some control of how it's withdrawn. That's not how taxes work. So I could imagine that the Republicans could say it's not a tax increase. The Democrats could say it is a tax increase because it is mandated. I mean, so it has a mandatory aspect to it. But it's a little vague as whether there's a tax increase or not. But there is new money. And you can't solve Social Security without new money. I don't think. Not without drastic benefit cuts. So that was the plan. I thought it was an interesting plan in the year 2000. We published it in 1999, actually. But then we had some time to work with. Now I think we've got less. So I don't know whether that would work today or not. But I'll stop there. I have some other stuff to talk about if there's time. But
Can I ask you guys a question on time?
Let's go to discussion amongst the group now.
Okay.
And Gopi, feel free to jump in as well.
I have a question on time. So one of the things, and you kind of mentioned your plan, you'd hold everyone 55 and older harmless. Many of the reform plans that have been circulated in the last decade hold people 55 and older harmless. I know I look 28, but I'm 53, which means in 2 years, I get to that point where I say, don't touch my Social Security, hold me harmless. When we did the 83 reforms, we raised the Social Security retirement age. It took 40 years to fully implement. Can we now, to your point, John, because you have talked about the short-term, intermediate, and long-term, can we, one, even do something like that in any reform that basically phases in over a longer period of time, like decades? And two, can we hold people 55 and older harmless? Are we going to have to hit near retirees and current beneficiaries? The idea before we're 55 is that you gave, basically they didn't have time to make adjustments and those younger did, but can we even afford to do that anymore?
I think probably not. And that's a shame. I mean, we've kicked the can down the road a long time. President Clinton understood the problem. George W. Bush understood the problem. Unfortunately, neither of them got anything done. And then subsequent presidents, I don't know if they understood the problem or not because they didn't say anything about it. But I think we kicked the can down, and so we may not have the luxury of a slow, long phase in. And politically, it just makes it more difficult.
I think you've got to start phasing it in at a higher age. That is, I thought if Jimmy Carter can do it, Donald Trump could do it, Kamala Harris could do it. Maybe the political system has gotten less courageous since Carter. But I looked at the success rate of members of Congress who voted for the 77 reductions. How did they fare in the 78 election? How did they fare in the 1980 election? And you can find no evidence that they suffered any adverse consequences in terms of their reelection for having voted for this extraordinary package of big-time tax increases and benefit cuts for people who were nearing the age of retirement. So I've always felt that I'm not sure where the 55 came from, but we have a precedent for starting the benefit reductions.
I'm going to go.
Closer to retirement.
Gopi has a question, then we'll go to Andrew.
So, John, recently there's been a lot of action at the state level introducing these state IRAs, and they differ in a lot of different ways from the PSA 2000 plan, the add-on accounts that you were talking about. One is that they're voluntary. I mean, you're opted in, but you can remove your contributions and opt out if you wish. And they're not matched by either a state or an employer. Do you think those two features are really important in kind of making the add-on accounts in PSA 2000 improve retirement security?
Well, I do, actually. I think mandatory is important. Social Security never was a voluntary program. And so I think the mandatory parts, I also think there's some political appeal to this 100% match. It's kind of phony. I mean, you're basically, but still, if I am forced to put this 2.5%, it becomes 5 immediately. I think that could make it politically appealing. I don't think a voluntary plan even is going to quite cut it. The people that don't participate are the people you're most concerned about, probably.
Well, maybe the question, though, is that if for the upper half of the senior income distributions, they're saving enough money through voluntary retirement vehicles and some Social Security, maybe there's a way of addressing it by having a benefit of your type, John, the PSA account, just for low-income individuals. The one worry I have about it, and I had this as part of the Social Security Commission work that we did, about a mandatory, broad-based contribution system. Once government money starts flowing in, then you're going to see regulations of the type of investments that can be made. And that's not a healthy thing. We found over the years, of course, that politicians are just unable to keep their hands off of politically determining where investments take place and so forth. And so it's always been a worry. And if there's a way to confine those programs to those who really need it, that strikes me as a maybe a proper balance.
So, Andy,
I do think that the PSA accounts would, to some extent, crowd out the 401ks and the IRAs and so forth. And also, I mean, I'm not presenting this as something we should do or something that wouldn't be modified. I'm just saying what I was talking about 25 years ago. And at the time, it seemed pretty appealing. Whether at the time may be important.
Right, but the structure of it was very influential for the Social Security Commission, President Bush's Social Security Commission, which was about 6 years later, 5 years later. Tremendously influential. I mean, we did go with a flatter benefit schedule. We wanted to do that. And we did go with personal retirement accounts. And so both of the main features of that plan were represented in the various proposals offered by the Bush Commission.
right.
Sure. Let me ask it's sort of a question about the philosophy or the structure of the Social Security program that came up through the 1977 and later 1983 reforms. From the time Social Security was founded in 1935 up until the 1970s, benefit increases for either new or existing retirees were discretionary. They were granted by Congress, as needed and as affordable. And
Even numbered years.
yeah, and yes, those increases. Okay, but here's the interesting thing: those increases did tend to occur in election years, and obviously that's problematic. What happened in 1977 is reinforced in 1983 reforms was that benefit increases for future retirees were automatic. They were built into the formula. And I think in a way that might actually be more damaging in the sense that, especially the 1977 amendments, once you built this sort of what's called wage indexing into the benefit formula, it became an entirely a demographic issue with system financing. And I think at that time they could look forward and say, okay, we are going to go insolvent because the demographics turn against us. Notwithstanding the political problems of having discretionary benefit increases, might not it have been better to leave it under that old system? Congress would have increased benefits, yes, in election years, but they probably wouldn't have increased them so much that we would have the financing problem we have today. In other words, what they have to do today is not give smaller benefit increases, but they have to claw back an increase that in 7783 was built into the formula. Anyway, I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so two different thoughts. One is the rate of increase that they built in through wage indexing. Increases each cohort, retirement cohorts, benefits by the growth in real wages. They could have done something different. They could have indexed the system as was proposed at the time by indexing it to prices. And you wouldn't have had the big increase. And in fact, in work that Danny Heil and I have done, you would not have had an insolvency problem today if you had adopted the alternative method of indexing that was being proposed back in the 1970s at the time of that legislation. So one is the method of indexing. But Andrew, the extent to which Congress used those pieces of legislation prior to the 1970s to get large benefit increases for recipients, to expand other programs was extraordinary. They would attach all kinds of barnacles to a must-pass Social Security legislation. And the precipitating event I've always felt behind indexing, wage indexing, or any form of indexing was in 1972. So it's an election year. So Edwin Muskie is running for president. Wilbur Mills, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, is running for president. Hubert Humphrey is running for president, and George McGovern. They're all in the Senate, 3 in the Senate, Mills in the House. In March, the election season really starts off. Muskie proposes a 20% increase in Social Security benefits. McGovern follows with a 20% increase. Mills supports a 20% increase. Hubert Humphrey says, no, 25%. Okay. So then in mid-1972, they enacted a 20% increase. And I think Congress at that point was saying, stop us before we kill again. And that's what led, I think, to ultimately to the indexing.
And I would just add, you are seeing that today in the current candidates. No tax on Social Security, no tax on TIP. They keep one-upping each other to try to
exactly
do the same
right.
thing.
So I'm gonna cut this off for now, unless you have like 1 minute, John.
Oh, I was just going to, I'll just say one thing about price indexing. One is, two things. One is I ask people, if prices double and wages triple by 2050, will your benefits go up double or triple? They don't know. They don't know. Second thing is I kind of found appealing Robert Posen's idea of progressive price indexing, which basically said that if you're at the top, you're price indexed. If you're at the bottom, you're wage indexed. And it would gradually, very gradually, flatten benefits.
Okay, great. Thanks to you both for that panel.